Now, as you probably know, Nigeria's elections always attract considerable international attention because this country is seen as Africa's symbol and signal to the world, and 2023 is no exception. It'll be the largest national election on the African continent and one of the biggest in the world. It's also one of the most consequential, coming at a time when the subcontinent is witnessing coups and democracy appears to be under threat. It'll send a powerful message beyond this country's borders. So, how is it all looking so far from an international perspective? Well, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, both American election monitoring organizations, have just completed their second pre-election assessment as part of their joint observation of Nigeria's 2023 election. So for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by Santiago, Program Director for Nigeria at the International Republican Institute. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And of course, this upcoming ballot will be the, as we said, the largest elections on the African continent, arguably the most significant. How's it looking so far from your perspective? What's your assessment?
Well, thank you. And let me say first, I appreciate the opportunity to share the perspectives of the stakeholders that we've spoken with in our assessment over the course of this week. We had a high-level international delegation from both institutes. Our organizations are nonpartisan, apolitical, non-governmental. We are independent, and we stand with the Nigerian people in their aspirations for a credible, transparent, legitimate process. During the course of this week, we've been able to speak with many stakeholders, from civil society organizations to media, social, cultural, religious, political, government, security, and a very positive indication is that there is a real eagerness to engage. There's an eagerness to talk about the election, about the challenges. There's a real enthusiasm and optimism across many of the stakeholders that we spoke with. And there's also concerns. So just to start with the optimism, you know, we have a new electoral act that's been widely supported. We have electoral reforms that were demonstrated in both Osun and Ekiti gubernatorial elections, which went relatively well. There's a lot of, there's growing trust and confidence in electronic transmission and the BVAS system, as well as the IREV portal, where Nigerians can actually see the results from their polling stations and have confidence that what they witnessed at their polling unit is what is being counted. But there are also challenges that remain, and these challenges I would put into two buckets. One challenge is regarding process, and I think as I had mentioned earlier, we're on track for potentially the most procedurally sound election that Nigeria has ever had. Those pieces are in place, but there are gaps, and those gaps raise questions of legitimacy and the perceptions of legitimacy, which is just as important. So gaps, for example, the BVAS and electronic transmission. That is so central to the confidence of Nigerian voters. There are a lot of concerns about whether it will function properly on election day. It's one thing to hold an election in one state. It's another to hold it in 176,000 polling units across 36 states in the Federal Capital Territory. Will the IREV hold up? Will all of those results actually be accessible and visible? There are questions about the voter roll that we've recommended. In our report, we put forward 23 recommendations for key stakeholders. We've recommended with the voter roll that INEC clarify what are the criteria that are used to clean the register. How are duplicates and underage voters actually being dealt with? Because there are a lot of questions about the transparency of that process, questions about IDP voting, questions about PVC cards. Distribution is supposed to start on December 12th and then be decentralized to the ward level. Will that happen on time? What is the production timeline like? Will Nigerians be able to easily acquire and utilize their PVCs? And then on the security front, this is probably the most significant and consistent concern that we heard stakeholders.
Right, I want to come to that in a minute. Yeah. But I mean, you talked at the outset about seeing a significant improvement in election management.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that is cancelled out by the concerns that you've just raised, which are considerable.
I would say that the improvements we've seen thus far can be built upon. And we have just over 2 months until Election Day. Many of our recommendations are addressing areas where progress has been made, but where more progress needs to be made. As I mentioned with electronic transmission, a national stress test would be helpful to make sure that we don't have a problem on Election Day.
Does that look like that's going to happen?
Well, we have recommended it,
Right.
and INEC has been very engaged with all stakeholders, including with our delegation and civil society. So we have confidence that they intend to address many of these areas. And as I said, it's building upon the progress that's already been made. It needs to be done in many key areas, but these are areas where there already have been significant steps. I mentioned IDPs. We have a framework for IDPs. We've recommended that the INEC recs complete the surveys of the camps. There are concerns that with over 3 million IDPs before the flooding, and now another 1 or 2 million, that IDPs won't be included in an equitable way in the process. So that's an issue of taking what's already been developed with the framework and building on it. As well as with the voter roll, which has been subjected to public scrutiny and which is being worked on, and increasing, that process has increased confidence. But again, as confidence increases, these other questions emerge, and they should be addressed, because the legitimacy of the election is very important. And as we look around the country and at all of the different stakeholder groups, it's really important that Nigerians have confidence in the process.
And talking about confidence, what about things like political competition, political exclusion? How much destabilizing potential do you think issues like that have in this country?
In terms of election-related violence and destabilization, they're very significant concerns. One of the issues we heard from the stakeholders we spoke with was the peace pledge. The peace accord was signed on September 29th by most of the major presidential candidates. Since then, we've seen over 50 reported incidents of electoral violence in dozens of LGAs, over 40 LGAs in 24 states. And this includes everything from abductions of candidates, attacks on candidates, attacks on INEC offices, which are very concerning, destruction of voting material, in many cases where the perpetrators have not been caught, as well as really egregious public displays of partisan violence. And so one of the recommendations we've made in our report is that the international community really take those seriously, and where that type of violence, egregious violence by partisan operators and supporters, is being carried out, that those who orchestrate, who tolerate, who encourage that violence be held accountable, whether it's targeted sanctions, freezing assets, visa bans. These are serious impediments to an inclusive, transparent, credible process, and we've seen these issues in many parts of the country. It is a real disappointment that after the signing of this peace accord, there has been so much election-related violence and so much involvement by partisan operators. We hope that with the signing of the next accord, which will focus on accepting the results, we hope that that will have an impact. We also hope that additional measures will be put in place to deter this type of activity. Measures, for example...
well, I mean, I understand you're working with INEC to implement election violence prevention and mitigation programs. I think I read that somewhere.
So our international observation mission is independent of INEC. So we don't work directly with them. We're not working with them to build capacity. Many organizations are, and they're doing great work on that front. We are independent of them, but we do engage with them to hear how progress is going and to offer our recommendations as well.
Now, we know you talked about insecurity, which is
Yes.
obviously a big issue in this election. We know that the US Embassy in Nigeria raised the alarm in the summer about what it said were credible threats of insecurity in this country. And I mean, it led to evacuations and all kinds of a flurry of activity here. Did that feature in your analysis?
So insecurity is a general concern with all the stakeholders that we spoke with. And as you know, it's very complex in Nigeria. So that threat and other threats that have been reported are in a particular context, a particular dynamic. But there are many dynamics and contexts around the country. What stakeholders have told us is that not only has conflict increased, but it's spread geographically and it's become more complex. So we have more actors involved, we have more groups, we have more marginalized groups channelizing their grievances in one way or the other. And so it's a general backdrop to this election, but it poses real threats, logistical threats with the distribution of polling material. It stretches security forces thin. It makes it difficult for them to provide the security they need to provide on election day at all of those 176,000 polling stations. It hampers turnout. And following the 2019 election, which had the lowest turnout since Nigeria's return to democracy, that's a big concern. The credibility of this election in part hinges on inclusion and turnout, and we know that there's a huge amount of enthusiasm, not just among young people who've been registering at very high numbers, but across the board, multiple candidates who are viable, and an opportunity for change because it's an open seat. So whoever is elected will it'll be a different direction. So this enthusiasm has to find an outlet. It has to be able to participate in the process, and insecurity is one of the biggest threats to turnout and participation. It's also a threat to credibility, and one of our big concerns is strategic violence. Now that the process has improved at polling units with electronic transmission and with these other pieces from the Electoral Act that have been implemented, there are concerns that new tactics will be used, that we will see a greater reliance on removing voters from the equation through the use of strategic violence. And that's very concerning, and that's something that we've called for security forces to try to anticipate and address, because that's a real threat to the legitimacy, the perceived legitimacy and the credibility of the process.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial thing. And we heard the Chief of Defense Staff, General Lucky Araba, just come out, I think it was just a few hours ago, to reassure Nigerians that the military was going to be very supportive of the process. But I wonder what kinds of impressions you're getting from listening to people like that and getting a general sense of how this, because I mean what you're talking about is an absolutely crucial part of this confidence building.
Yes, so we have heard a real willingness from security forces to receive information and analysis, to think about contingencies, to try to identify flashpoints and hotspots ahead of time. We've seen positive developments from the police in terms of what they say about their willingness to address electoral offenses. One of our recommendations in the report, based on the concerns raised to us by stakeholders, is that electoral offenders be arrested and charged in greater numbers than we've seen in places like Ekiti and Osun, where vote buying was quite egregious and very few people were arrested. In our discussions with security forces, we've heard that they've really tried to address some of these issues through training, and that they're committed to having their officers be more proactive in terms of addressing electoral offenses. The stakeholders that we spoke with hope that this is the case. It's a positive sign that they're aware of these issues and willing to engage. And we hope that they take them seriously going forward.
And I mean, I don't know if this is an inappropriate question, but I mean, do you see this as a two-way race, a three-way race, a four-way race, or a much wider field?
Yeah, so our organizations are here to advance democracy, right? To work with the Nigerian people and help them fulfill their aspirations. We want a credible process. We want an inclusive process, as do Nigerians, right? The stakeholders that we spoke with are excited and optimistic, as I said, but they are wary and there are concerns that it will be a truly inclusive and credible process. With the enthusiasm that's building, that is very positive for democracy. The choices that people have, this opportunity to choose a new direction with an open seat for the first time since 2007, it has a lot of people excited, and that excitement and enthusiasm is what you need for a robust democracy. So whoever is chosen, we hope that it reflects the will of Nigerians and is the product of a very robust turnout and engagement. And if there is a runoff, we hope that there is clarification and understanding of the criteria that's used, of the timeline. There's been confusion about, what determines the first and second candidate, et cetera. We hope that INEC and others in civil society and the media really educate voters so that if it does move to a runoff, it's a new exciting phase in Nigerian democracy that people will embrace, rather than a point of confusion that can undermine the credibility of the process.
And that's a very important point. I want to thank you very much indeed for this pre-election assessment, and that is of course Santiago Stocker, who's the program director for Nigeria at the International Republican Institute. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.